By 1944, Japan's greatest battleship wasn't the Yamato, it was the desperate hope that just one oil convoy might slip through the Pacific alive. Because beneath the waves, American submarines were turning an empire into a starving giant. Japanese admirals watched their fleets rust at anchor, pilots grounded, soldiers stranded, all because fuel simply vanished. This is the story of how U.S. submariners waged a silent war that strangled Japan's war machine, and what Japan's own admirals said as their empire ran dry. In the early 1930s, Japan stood at the height of its ambition, a rising empire defined by steel, discipline, and a rapidly expanding vision of military destiny. Battleships thundered down slipways in Kure and Yokosuka. Factories in Osaka glowed through the night as workers produced aircraft, engines, and munitions in numbers the nation had never attempted before. Yet beneath all this momentum lay a quiet, crippling truth. The empire ran on fuel it did not possess. Japan had virtually no significant domestic petroleum reserves. 90% of its oil came from abroad, flowing in from the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and most importantly, the United States. Every destroyer that patrolled the Pacific, every Zero fighter that climbed into the sky, every truck supplying the Kwantung Army, all depended on tankers crossing thousands of miles of exposed ocean. To military planners, this reliance was not simply a vulnerability. It was a strategic nightmare waiting to be exposed. No one understood this more clearly than Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and a former naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the industrial might of the United States up close. Inside the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, Yamamoto and his peers studied fuel consumption charts with growing unease. They knew the truth that few dared to speak aloud. Without constant resupply, the Imperial Japanese Navy could not sustain operations for more than a year. Then, in July 1941, the nightmare arrived. After Japan's occupation of French Indochina, the United States issued a full oil embargo. Overnight, the empire's supply line collapsed. Tankers stopped sailing. Storage tanks at naval bases were sealed, their remaining fuel measured down to the last barrel. Officers inside the Naval Ministry described the mood as a mixture of shock and disbelief, followed by a cold, mathematical realization. Without access to new oil, the fleet would soon be unable to train, to deploy, or even to move. Japan was now racing against a ticking clock. Every strategic meeting, every war game, every diplomatic negotiation revolved around a single, suffocating question. How long could the empire survive before its engines ran dry? Capturing oil fields in Southeast Asia became not an option, but a necessity. Yet even those who argued for bold action understood the peril that waited beyond the horizon. Japan could seize oil fields, but holding them would mean nothing if American submarines decided to hunt the empire's lifeline. The war beneath the Pacific began not with triumph, but with bitter frustration. In the months after Pearl Harbor, American submarine crews rushed into the vastness of the Western Pacific with one mission: strangle Japan's maritime lifelines. Yet patrol after patrol returned empty, their torpedo rooms still crowded with unused Mark 14s. Something was terribly wrong. The Mark 14 was supposed to be the most advanced torpedo in the world, fast, powerful, guided by magnetic detonators designed to explode beneath a ship's keel. But in 1942, it became the symbol of a hidden crisis. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly under enemy hulls. Others struck targets with a metallic thud, failing to detonate. Some curved unpredictably off course, sending skippers lunging for the periscope in disbelief. Commanders who reported the failures were told they were mistaken, urged to aim better, or simply ignored. As Japanese convoys sailed through narrow straits and shipping lanes, American submarines shadowed them helplessly, watching opportunities slip away. The turning point came with a man determined to break the silence. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, arrived in Hawaii in early 1943 and began demanding answers. He ordered live-fire tests, the first in years, against cliffs, nets, and obsolete ships. The results confirmed every complaint his skippers had risked their careers to voice. Lockwood pressed the Bureau of Ordnance relentlessly, forcing redesigns to the magnetic pistols, depth mechanisms, and firing systems. By mid-1943, the Mark 14 finally became what it had always been advertised to be, a reliable, lethal weapon. At the same time, America's approach beneath the waves changed dramatically. Submarines received new surface search radar, allowing them to hunt at night and in foul weather. Ultra-intelligence began revealing convoy routes, and doctrine shifted from cautious lone wolf patrols to aggressive wolfpack tactics, with multiple submarines coordinating attacks across hundreds of miles. The undersea war had transformed almost overnight. For the men on board, the psychological shift was immediate. After 18 months of failure, they now possessed weapons that worked, intelligence that guided them, and orders that encouraged bold action. The Pacific, once dominated by Japanese shipping, became a hunting ground. Tankers, freighters, and troopships that had once sailed unchallenged now moved in fear, their decks lined with lookouts scanning for a periscope that could appear anywhere. One moonlit night in late 1943, a lone American submarine tracked a fully loaded Japanese tanker as it crept across the Luzon Strait. 2 torpedoes struck home. In seconds, the night sky lit with a towering fireball, fuel cascading across the water in burning ribbons. Japan had built its empire on oil, and now those tankers were burning faster than the empire could replace them. By 1944, the Pacific had become an ocean-wide killing field, stretching from the Philippines to the South China Sea, and from the Solomon Islands to the Dutch East Indies. Japanese merchant shipping, once the lifeblood of an empire, was now a prey hunted relentlessly beneath the waves. Every tanker, freighter, and troop transport carried more than cargo. It carried the fragile thread sustaining Japan's industrial and military machine. And American submarines had learned to sever that thread with ruthless efficiency. The numbers were staggering. Between 1942 and the end of 1944, U.S. submarines sank over 4.8 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, obliterating the logistical foundation of the empire. Entire tanker fleets vanished from the maps of Japanese ports. By late 1944, less than 10% of the vessels that once carried vital fuel remained operational, often damaged, stripped of escorts, or forced into perilous zigzagging corridors through waters that had once been considered safe. Convoys, which had once moved in disciplined formation under the protection of destroyers and aircraft, now sailed in isolation, each ship a vulnerable target under a sunless sky. Japanese admirals voiced the fear that permeated the high command. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inao described the U.S. submarine campaign as the most terrible threat Japan faced, acknowledging a danger that could not be mitigated by bravery or tactical cunning alone. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, a strategist of the Imperial Navy, warned grimly that, without oil, the fleet is reduced to mere ornaments, a statement that cut through the veneer of military pride and stripped strategy down to its coldest arithmetic. Without fuel, even the proud battleships of the combined fleet were nothing more than floating monuments, unable to sail, to maneuver, or to defend. The human cost of this strategy was immediate and terrifying. A convoy captain in the South China Sea, aware that his vessel had no air cover, no destroyer screen, and no hope of reinforcements, watched torpedo wakes slice silently through the water around him. Each explosion echoed across the hulls, the fire and smoke climbing higher than the masts. Men scrambled to abandon ship, their lives now dependent on the mercy of currents and lifeboats. Across the Pacific, thousands of such moments repeated in silence, unrecorded yet crucial, eroding the confidence and morale of an entire nation. By the end of 1944, Japan's naval command no longer planned for decisive battles. Instead, they calculated attrition, how many days, weeks, or months the empire could survive without the blood of supply lines. Oil, once the hidden pulse of the empire, had become the axis of its vulnerability. Convoys burned, tankers vanished, and the countdown to collapse, invisible, relentless, and unstoppable, had begun. Japan's admirals weren't planning battles anymore. They were calculating how long an empire can live without blood. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had become a fleet of ghosts. The proud battleships that had once thundered across the Pacific, the carriers whose dive bombers had rewritten naval warfare at Pearl Harbor, were now largely anchored, their hulls glinting in the sun while their engines sat silent. Fuel, the lifeblood of the empire, had dwindled to a fraction of what was needed for even routine operations. Ships existed in form but not in function, a paradox that Japanese planners struggled to reconcile. The contrast could not have been starker. In 1941, the combined fleet had moved like a predator across the ocean, coordinated strikes spanning hundreds of miles, pilots pushing aircraft to the edge of endurance, fueled by a seemingly endless supply of oil. Now, in 1944-45, those same squadrons trained in gliders or on stripped-down trainers, preserving the few gallons of aviation fuel left for the rare sorties deemed absolutely necessary. Naval staff documents recorded the collapse with clinical precision. Combat sorties had fallen by over 80%. Strategy was no longer dictated by enemy movements or objectives, but by the cruel arithmetic of consumption. For the men at the heart of the fleet, the impact was immediate and human. Young pilots were briefed on missions that would stretch fuel to the very edge, sometimes leaving no margin for return. Mechanics worked feverishly, dismantling grounded aircraft to keep one or two operational, cannibalizing engines, instruments, and even propellers just to sustain minimal combat readiness. Ships and planes were no longer tools of projection. They had become fragile symbols of what was left of an empire teetering on exhaustion. Admiral Shigeyoshi Toyoda, Chief of Staff of the combined fleet, summed it up with grim honesty. Operations are decided not by strategy, but by fuel. His words were not an abstraction. Each movement of the fleet required meticulous calculations, each sortie measured in minutes, each mission a gamble against the invisible clock of depletion. Even minor miscalculations could strand ships at sea, pilots over open water, or entire squadrons grounded at their airfields, watching the enemy advance while waiting for oil that would never come. The psychological toll mirrored the strategic one. Pride, initiative, and morale gave way to frustration, fear, and fatalism. A navy once built to dominate the Pacific now measured fuel in hours, not barrels. Anchored ships became islands of stasis in harbors once brimming with kinetic energy. The empire's tools of war had become prisoners of the very lifeblood that had once empowered them. Japan's fleet had been forged for movement, for strike, for domination. Now it could barely move at all, trapped in harbors and docks while the war raged beyond its reach, the tides of fuel scarcity dictating every decision, every mission, and every hope. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a reality it had long feared but seldom faced openly. Naval records, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal a leadership consumed not by the movement of enemy fleets, but by the relentless arithmetic of scarcity. The oil that had once powered Japan's expansion, that had fueled the triumphs at Pearl Harbor and the early campaigns across the Pacific, had dwindled to near nothing. Strategy, pride, and tradition collided with an unyielding truth. Without fuel, the fleet was powerless. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's warning, made years earlier with prescient clarity, echoed through the corridors of the Naval Ministry. If I am told to fight, I can promise 6 months of victories. After that, I can guarantee nothing. Those words were no longer hypothetical. By autumn 1944, 6 months had passed, and the empire's once feared navy was immobilized, its carriers moored, its battleships anchored like monuments to a lost era. Yamamoto's prediction, was now a somber prophecy realized. In Tokyo, the tone of naval strategy meetings shifted from confident planning to grim confession. Admirals gathered around maps, marking dwindling fuel stocks, calculating hours of operation rather than tactical advantage. Some admitted quietly that reserves were sufficient for only a single major fleet action, a desperate gamble that could not be repeated. Others argued for caution, proposing that the fleet be preserved for a hypothetical final battle, even as supplies dwindled by the day. Debate was sharp but ultimately meaningless. The Empire's lifeblood was gone, and no argument could replace barrels of fuel. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Yamamoto's successor as chief of the Naval General Staff, articulated the starkest assessment. Our ships may exist, but they can no longer fight. The statement was both tactical and existential. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers sat idle in harbors, their crews trained and ready, but their engines silent. Aircraft squadrons were grounded, pilots stripped of the ability to launch beyond glider practice and short, fuel-starved exercises. The pride of the combined fleet had become a fleet of shadows, present but impotent. The psychological toll was immense. For the first time in modern Japanese history, admirals spoke not of defeat at the hands of an enemy fleet, but of defeat imposed by an absence. The empty tanks that rendered strategy irrelevant, heroism ineffective, and technology meaningless. The Empire's leadership, trained for boldness and decisive action, found itself paralyzed by a slow, inescapable attrition. Fuel shortages were no longer a logistical problem. They were the axis around which the collapse of the Japanese Navy would pivot. In these final months, the pride, skill, and audacity that had carried Japan across the early war years were confronted by a merciless reality. For the first time, the Empire's greatest minds acknowledged that victory was not being denied by enemy prowess, but by the relentless, invisible hand of scarcity, and that hand would determine the fate of the Pacific. By the final months of World War II, the destruction that had carved Japan's empire to pieces was not always visible from the air or the battlefield. It happened quietly, beneath the waves, where a handful of American submariners carried out a campaign that would cripple the industrial and military heart of an empire. Only 2% of U.S. Navy personnel served in submarines, yet this small force sank more than half of Japan's merchant fleet, cutting the veins that supplied oil, steel, food, and reinforcements. The strategic consequences were staggering. Factories in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya slowed to a crawl without fuel to power machinery and transport raw materials. Battleships and carriers remained moored in harbors, their engines silent, while squadrons of aircraft sat idle on airstrips, grounded by shortages that no ingenuity could overcome. Japanese soldiers, scattered across Southeast Asia, watched supply convoys vanish, leaving them stranded in jungles, deserts, and islands with dwindling rations and no prospect of relief. Every torpedo fired in the Pacific echoed not just as an explosion in the water, but as a crushing blow to the Empire's capacity to sustain war. Historians often highlight the dramatic headlines: the firebombings of Tokyo, the invasion of Okinawa, the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet the reality that shaped Japan's defeat was far more insidious and methodical. The submarine campaign was a war fought in shadows, across thousands of miles of open ocean, targeting the arteries of supply rather than the battlefield itself. Every tanker set ablaze, every freighter sent to the depths, further starved the islands of the resources necessary for survival and combat. For Japanese admirals, the campaign was bewildering and humiliating. They had trained for decisive fleet engagements, for carrier battles, for torpedo attacks and naval maneuvers across the Pacific. Instead, victory slipped away in silence. The empire they had painstakingly built, the fleet they had meticulously maintained, the air power they had nurtured, all eroded by men they never saw, operating from the shadows with stealth, patience, and relentless precision. By war's end, Japanese commanders no longer asked how to win. They asked how it all disappeared, vanished beneath the waves, leaving harbors full of idle ships and skies crowded with grounded aircraft. The Empire's lifelines had been cut one ship at a time, and with each sinking, the inevitability of collapse grew sharper, closer, and undeniable. It was a silent victory, but one that reshaped the Pacific forever. The oceans had become a weapon, and in the quiet of the deep, the fate of a nation was sealed.